Where are all the Valyrian Steel swords in Westeros? They could be very useful at the wall, but who is holding them all? Let's take a look. Hi everyone, this is Robert. Welcome to Deep Geek. On this channel we dive deep into George R. R. Martin's world of ice and fire, as well as The Lord of the Rings, The Witcher and more. Welcome. In my previous video, we looked at what Valyrian Steel is, that it is forged with magic and has magical properties, not least, very probably, that it can kill the others. We concluded that it would be very useful indeed at the wall, but that at the current moment in the story there is only one Valyrian Steel sword there, Longclaw. So where else might the Night's Watch look for Valyrian Steel weapons? Thankfully, over the centuries and even millennia of the Valyrian freehold, thousands of Valyrian steel blades were produced, and some made their way over the narrow sea. We read in the world of ice and fire that 2 centuries passed after the founding of Dragonstone, centuries in which the coveted Valyrian steel began to trickle into the Seven Kingdoms more swiftly than before, though not swiftly enough for all the lords and kings who desired it. How many? Well, obviously the supply of Valyrian steel swords dried up with the doom of Valyria, but the Valyrian freehold was around for a very long time, so even if they were produced at a very slow rate, that's still a lot, as Tyrion notes. Valyrian steel blades were scarce and costly, yet thousands remained in the world, perhaps 200 in the Seven Kingdoms alone. This estimate is confirmed in the world of ice and fire, where we read that in the Seven Kingdoms, there are only 227 such weapons, according to Archmaester Thurgood's inventories, some of which have since been lost or have disappeared from the annals of history. So, around 200 Valyrian steel blades in the Seven Kingdoms. Although, do note the careful language usage here. That's blades, not just swords. So that includes daggers and knives and axes and whatever else, as well as swords. And of those couple of hundred or so, we actually only know the whereabouts of less than 24, less than 10% of the total. We'll get back to where those other 90% might be in a moment, but let's run down what we do know. Given how jealously they are guarded by the noble houses that possess them, surprisingly few Valyrian steel swords that we know of are still with their original owner families. Just 2 we know for sure. There is Lady Forlorn of House Corbray, currently with Lyn Corbray, and Heartsbane of House Tarly, currently with Randall Tarly. There are a couple more that are probably still in their original owner's hands, it's just that we haven't heard about them specifically in the main story. Vigilance of House Hightower, and a Valyrian steel axe apparently owned by House Celtigar. Then there are quite a few that have changed hands for various reasons. Obviously, Jon Snow currently has Longclaw, which was for 500 years the ancestral sword of House Mormont. Red Rain, now held by House Drum of the Iron Islands, was taken by them, they paid the iron price, in a raid. Some fans suspect from House Rain of the Westerlands. Similarly, Nightfall of House Harlaw was taken from a dead corsair by Dalton Greyjoy, and is now somehow with Harris Harlaw. There is also Widow's Wail and Oathkeeper, the 2 swords forged from ice, the Stark ancestral sword. Widow's Wail was Joffrey's and is now Tommen's, and Brienne has Oathkeeper after Jaime gave it to her. And let's not forget what we call the Cat's Paw Dagger, that, according to show canon, once belonged to House Targaryen, but somehow in recent years Littlefinger got hold of it, before losing it in a bet with King Robert. It was then used in the assassination attempt on Bran, and now Littlefinger has it back again. Then there is the long list of those swords that we simply do not know where they are now. Leading the list is Blackfire, the sword of the Targaryen kings. That was last seen being removed from the Battle of the Redgrass Field by Aegor Rivers, Bittersteel, at the end of the First Blackfire Rebellion, and presumably taken over to Essos by him. We might have expected it to appear in one of the later Blackfire Rebellions, but it didn't. So it has disappeared from history, like the male line of Blackfires. I have my suspicions as to where it is now, but I will save them for another video. Similarly, I have my suspicions about where Dark Sister is. Dark Sister being the other Valyrian steel sword owned by House Targaryen. It has been wielded by such notables as Queen Visenya Targaryen, Daemon Targaryen and Bloodraven. It was last seen at the wall with Bloodraven, but clearly isn't there now. Lamentation, House Royce's sword, was lost in the storming of the Dragon Pit. Orphan Maker, House Roxton's sword, was last seen with Unwin Peak before his spectacular fall from grace, and Sandok the Shadow had a great curved Valyrian steel sword, although its fate is also unknown. There's also a passing mention of the treasure that Euron Greyjoy used to bribe or reward the Ironborn captains for voting for him at the Kingsmoot, which apparently included daggers, plural, of Valyrian steel. We don't know exactly who took them. And other than a couple of blades we hear of that are probably still over in Essos, that's about it. For those wondering, Dawn, the greatsword of House Dane, shares many of the characteristics of Valyrian steel, but is definitively not made of Valyrian steel. But again, that probably deserves a video of its own. So where are the rest, the other 180 or so? Intriguingly, we can probably assume that quite a few families you might expect to have Valyrian steel swords actually don't, because surely we would have heard of them. It seems inconceivable that we could spend so much time in the presence of Robert, Stannis and Renly Baratheon and not hear about an ancestral Baratheon Valyrian steel sword. The same probably goes for houses Tully, Tyrell, Arryn, Velaryon and Martell. As always, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Perhaps some of them do have Valyrian steel swords, but just keep them in a treasury somewhere and never use them or talk about them. It's possible. Nevertheless, as we know that it was mostly lords and kings who bought Valyrian steel weapons from the Valyrians, and most of those were bought in the couple of 100 years before the Doom, we should probably look to houses that were rich or had a point to prove during that time, or have a particularly martial history, and we haven't seen too much of in the main story. Perhaps some of the ancient houses in the Reach, Rowan, Florent or Redwine perhaps, or some of the Stormland Marcher lords, houses Caron or Swan maybe, or some of the richer families of the Westerlands, the Crakehalls or Presters are possible. When you start digging into it, there are actually quite a lot of houses out there that might have been in a position to buy a Valyrian steel blade at the time, and even if they could not afford a mighty sword, then surely a ceremonial dagger would have been cheaper. As George R. R. Martin himself clarified way back in 2008, there are more Valyrian steel swords than we have seen so far. Not all of them belong to the great houses. Lesser nobility would oft purchase one as well, for the prestige, and sometimes knights or even lesser swords would acquire one on the battlefield after the original owner fell. Of course, the problem remains that even if you know where they all are, how are you going to get them to the wall to help against the others? The Night's Watch certainly can't afford to buy them off anyone. Tywin Lannister had tried for decades to buy a Valyrian steel sword, with all the wealth of Casterly Rock at his disposal, but to no avail. The Night's Watch would have no chance. They have also already tried to convince the Lords of the Land of the very real threat from the north, and only Stannis responded. Everyone else was far too busy focusing on the very real civil war on their own doorsteps. As Jon rather sardonically concludes, "If I can just convince the Lords of the Seven Kingdom to give us their Valyrian blades, all is saved. That won't be hard." His laugh had no mirth in it. Which leaves three main options that I can think of. You could try to get some from Essos, and it's possible that some will come across with Fagon then Dany's invasions, or you could try to attract individuals who happen to possess Valyrian steel blades north to help. On the TV show, for example, Oathkeeper, Heartsbane, Widow's Wail and the Cat's Paw Dagger all made their way to Winterfell in the end. Surely at least some of them will in the books too, plus perhaps Dark Sister and Lady Forlorn. That's a start. And thirdly, perhaps you could get hold of some Valyrian steel in another form you could reforge into swords or daggers, say. We know there are some people who can do this. In King's Landing there is Tobbo Mott, who forged Oathkeeper and Widow's Wail from ice. And how much does his apprentice Gendry know? He has set himself up as a smith in the Riverlands, and there has to be someone in this citadel who knows to be making all those Valyrian steel chain links. And as well as whatever stores the citadel has, there is some Valyrian steel out there that could be used. Marwyn the Mage will have a Valyrian steel mask, rod and ring as Archmaester of the Higher Mysteries. Several more maesters will have that link in their chain. Dragonbinder, that massive magic horn Euron has, is banded with Valyrian steel. And in a pre-released chapter of The Winds of Winter, he also seems to be in possession of a whole suit of Valyrian steel armour. Talking of which, Aegon II wore something similar in House of the Dragon, and Daemon gave Rhaenyra a Valyrian steel necklace. Semi-canon to be sure, but it makes sense that the Targaryens had more Valyrian steel than just those two swords. Aegon the Conqueror's crown was Valyrian steel, for example. In practice, I suspect that a combination of all these possibilities will happen. Some heroes will make their way north with their Valyrian steel swords, some of their own volition and others perhaps manipulated by light or shadowy forces. Perhaps some Valyrian steel will be able to be reforged into more useful forms. Not enough to arm an entire army perhaps, but enough to echo the small group of heroes suggested by the myths of the Last Hero and Azor Ahai. Although it certainly won't feel like enough to turn the tide against the mighty army of the dead. So they will almost certainly need to turn to dragonglass as well, which is a lot more readily available and less costly, if they can persuade whoever is in charge of Dragonstone at the time to give them access to the mines. But that is a whole other issue. Which swords do you think will make their way north in the last two books of A Song of Ice and Fire? Let me know in the comments section below, and keep an eye out for more videos from me on Blackfire and maybe even Dark Sister. I'm sure they will play an important part in the story to come. If you'd like to see more videos like this digging deep into A Song of Ice and Fire, there's a link to my playlist on the left of the screen. Or to support this channel, thank you, there's a link to my Patreon page on the right of your screen. That's all for this time. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again soon.